Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today we have participants from different time zone, and it's a pleasure to welcome each one of you. I hope and wish you all are safe and doing well. In this season, we are discussing business process management from confusion to clarity. In episode 1, we discussed to demystify business process management with Mr. Prashant Hoskote. We discussed various questions about business process management, got the clarity, understanding some examples from Mr. Prashant Hoskote based on his experience. The recording of this webinar is available on our website. And after our today's webinar also, you will get an email with the link of our official website where recordings can be found, and you can contact us for any question or any information. We would love to hear from you and discuss with you. In our episode 2 today, we are going to discuss the essentials of business process management for any organization who's planning for implementing business process management journey, adopting business process management journey. And this season 1, episode 2, we have invited Mr. Roger Tregear. Roger, who is having more than 20 years of experience exclusively into business process management. He's an author of many internationally recognized books on business process management. And I'm very happy and I welcome Roger for his participation, for his time to conduct for this webinar too. Thank you so much, Roger, for your time. And I will not take much time. I would like you to take it over and discuss about business process management. Over to you, Roger.
Thank you, Amit, and thanks to you and the team at Q3 Edge for making all this possible. And hello to everybody around the world. I hope you're all doing well and looking forward to coming out of these difficult times. So we're going to talk today about enabling process-based management. Process-based management is the term that I use for the management philosophy of BPM. We can use the term BPM as well, as long as we mean the emphasis being on management and putting process at the center of business management. So this is the sort of thing we're going to talk about today. Just touch on these very briefly and then we'll come back to them, of course. I want to talk first about cross-functional value delivery, because that's fundamental to the whole process view. And then I want to explain to you what I mean by the primacy of process. I think it's the fundamental principle of process-based management. Then I want to introduce you to the Tregear circles. I think this is a really nice, useful, practical meta model for what we mean when we say process management and improvement. And we'll talk about getting the circles turning. And then how do we get the circles to turn? We'll explain that there are 7 things, 7 elements that enable the circles to turn. I want to touch briefly on BPM maturity, but BPM maturity measures how good we are at doing all of this. And if it's worth doing, then it's worth getting better at it. So we should be thinking about that. And then how do we pull all this together? How do we get this started and keep it going as a useful management tool, which will lead us into to a brief comment on the next 2 webinars in the following 2 weeks. So that's what we're going to be doing in this session. Please, if you've got any questions at any time, just put them in the Q&A box. If we don't get to them today, I'll certainly follow them up and we'll send out written answers through the week. But if you've got a question at any time, please put it in there. If we can deal with it as we go, I will, but otherwise we'll certainly catch up with them after the session. Now, we're going to be using this little feedback tool called Poll Everywhere. Now, you've had some information about this already, and I hope you've gone to that web page there, pollev.com/Roger Tregear 780. And if you have, you'll just have a waiting screen there. So, little test question to make sure it's working for us. So I've just put this up, and now you should have a question on whatever screen you're using. And you can see there it just says enter a response. So you enter a response and you click submit. And yeah, you're getting it. So we've got lots of coming in there. There's a little lag as it all happens. So we'll use this several times as we go through, just to get a little feedback and to share a couple of ideas of what of some feedback and how your organisations map onto the sorts of things that we're talking about. Okay, so that was just a little test, so we can all have a play with it. Let's move on to the real deal. So I want to talk first about cross-functional value delivery. So here's an example. None of us have done this for a while, I guess, but we remember how it works. When we're catching a flight, we get to the airport and check in, we board the plane, we complete the flight, we retrieve our luggage, we hope, and we depart the airport. And there are 5 steps shown there. And if I'm sure you would say, if I asked you, if I said which of those 5 need to go well for us to have a great flight, of course you'd say all 5. No point having a fancy check-in and get the upgrade and you get to the other end and your luggage doesn't. That's not going to be a great trip. So each of those pieces needs to work well, of course. But perhaps even more importantly, they've got to work well together. And really what we're talking about is a larger process, and let's call it relocate traveller. Now, all of our organisations, in everything we do, we're involved in that kind of cross-functional creation and delivery of value all day long. That's how organisations work. We've got individual pieces of the organisation running the bits of it. Someone's looking after check-in, people handling baggage, etc. But all of that needs to work well together. And that's the whole point of cross-functional processes, because that's what every organisation is doing all the time. Or if it's not doing that, then it's not providing the sort of value that it would like to be. Okay, so following on then from cross-functional value delivery, we can build what I call the #1 principle of primacy of process. So every organisation has these 2 perspectives. There's a functional organisation. It's characterised by the organisation chart. We're familiar with this. Everybody's got this, even if you don't have a written organisation chart, you could draw one if you need to. We need to know who reports to who, where the authorities are, where the delegations are, and then we group people in terms of their like skills or like objectives. So this is largely about managing up and down the organisation. But we've just been saying, though, that we create, accumulate and deliver value across the organisation. And that's characterised by process architecture. We'll speak a lot more about process architectures in our webinar next week, but it's a view of the organisation as a set of processes. So in the vertical direction, it's largely about managing resources, but we actually deliver value in the horizontal direction, which, by the way, is the same as saying that's how we execute strategy. And there's a missing piece, isn't there? Because whose job is it to manage across the organisation? Well, nobody's really. The organisation chart says nothing about how we manage across the organisation. So we've got this, all of our organisations can have this horizontal vision problem that we need to fix, and we need a management add-on to correct that vision problem. Okay, so how do we do that? How would that be working in practice? Well, let's go to the circles. So 2 circles here. There's a whole chapter in my book about this, so I can't choose a really short version now, but 2 circles, process ownership and process improvement. In the PO circle, we've got 3 nodes, target, assess, respond. So for each process that's under active management, we're going to set some KPIs and targets. How do we want this process to work? Then we're going to assess that performance, both in terms of performance anomalies, signals we might be getting from our charts, but also new ideas that have come up. So target, assess. And then, of course, if we don't respond, the whole thing is a waste of time. So 3 things we might do to respond. One is nothing. There's nothing to do. Everything's fine. keep going. We'll keep checking, but nothing to do. We might decide that we need to review our KPIs and targets because something has changed in the process or our requirement for process performance has changed. So there's some kind of review required there. Or the third thing that might happen is that some intervention is required because there's a process problem or some opportunity that we've got to check. And that'll trigger a turn of the PI circle. Now, the PI circle then is going to just be the process improvement methodology that you would normally use. That might be Lean or Six Sigma, or it might be Sprint Pip or Nest, or whatever methodology you're using fits right in there as is to be to do. It's shown there in the most abstract form, just so everyone can fit a process in there. So what's happening if we're doing this? Well, we're all the time in the PO circle, we're looking to see if there's action needed to be taken on processes that we're actively managing. So this is the cross-functional the horizontal cross-functional management piece, the missing piece of management that we correct with this bit. And then, of course, when we need to do something, we trigger PI circle. So if you like, this is continuous process management as well as continuous process improvement. And I talk all the time about get the circles turning, and now you know what I mean by that. So how do we get the circles to turn? Well, we use the 7 enablers of BPM. So these are the 7 things that enable the circles to turn. And there's 7 elements that we need to develop. We need them all, and we need to develop them more or less at the same time so that we've got some good capability of implementing process-based management and making it work. Let me talk about each of those briefly in turn. As I say, they're all equally important, but we'll start with architecture because we don't know what our processes are, we can't do much else. So process architecture is about creating the process architecture down as many levels as we like, but it's about making all of our processes visible, naming them, showing their relationships. Then we want to know 2 things about performance. We want to know what measures we should use to test process performance. So how should it perform? And then how is it performing? That will give us a performance gap. Then we need to say, okay, do we care about that gap? Is it an important gap? Is it causing an actual business problem that needs to be fixed? So, and what are we going to do about that? So that's process governance. Now we've got a process owner and we've got governance mechanisms to make those kinds of decisions in a nice, consistent way. It's about minding the gap. It's about prioritizing what things we think we should be changing. Middle of this list, but fundamental to everything we do, is process change, the 4th enabler. And if we're not making change, which is to say, if we're not making genuine process improvements in terms of business performance, then what do we, by our own definitions, what we're doing is a waste of time. So we need to be making those sorts of changes. We need to build a process mindset, or if you prefer, a process-aware culture across the organization, because if we're going to do process, we've got to think process. And we all have to have a similar mindset about process. What are we doing this for? How are we doing it? We need to have a single mindset in the organization about what it is we're trying to do. And then process capability here just means the ability of everybody who needs to be involved to be able to use the tools and techniques that we want them to use. And as I say there in the shorthand form, we don't want just 5 process analysts, we want 5,000. And I mean by that, we want everyone to be involved in the analysis and improvement of processes, because the subject matter experts in our processes are the ones out there executing and managing them right now. So of course, they're the ones who need to be involved, and we need lots of people involved if we're going to actually get continuous improvement. And then we need to provide some centralized support across the organization. The Office of BPM, the Process Excellence Team, whatever it is, we call it. But their job is not to do all of the work, all the process work, because that's self-limiting. Their job is to raise capability across the organization and to be internal consultants, if you like. So they're the 7 enablers. We need to build all of those. And that's not as hard to do as you might think. You might be thinking, gee, 7 things, that's tough. But it's not, because they're all very interrelated. You start working on one, then you'll have impacts on several others. And by the time you're working on several, then you're having impact on all of them. So, but you need a plan, and you need to be consciously working on each of those. So that's the 7 enablers. So architecture, describing the processes, then thinking about process performance, the measures, and then process governance. What are we going to do about those gaps? How do we prioritize? How do we deliver change? How do we change the process mindset across the organization? A real cultural mindset thing. How do we get everyone involved and give them the capability to be involved? And then how do we support everyone in doing that? So these are the 7 enablers. Here's a little exercise. This will come up now on your whatever screen you're looking at for Poll EV. And it's just saying for each of the process, each of the enablers, which of those do you think would be hardest to implement in your organization right now? And you can just tap on one on your screen and we'll start to see the results coming up. So we've got votes for architecture, measurement, mindset, capability. 2 for architecture. Let me just take the video images out of the way so I can see. Okay, mindset is the winner so far. Are we all done? Are we all finished? Now, of course, this is just a simple little exercise, and it's certainly not meant to be by any way definitive. But it's interesting that the most we have there, I guess that's what 4 out of 10 so far, is for mindset. I think mindset is the hardest. That's my general experience. But I should say, of course, that none of these are easy, and it will be different in different organizations. It depends on the nature of the organization, its current culture, its involvement with process. It will be different, and for the same organization, it's going to change over time as well. But it's an interesting thing to think about from time to time, and just step back and say, okay, what's happening here, and what is it we're having difficulty with right now? What is it that we're struggling with? Where should we focus? Maybe different parts of the organization are having different difficulties, because we've got to be building all of these. And of course, different people in the same organization will have a different view of this as well. So it's nice to just kind of share those views and have a conversation about that. If someone thinks capability is the hardest and someone else thinks mindset is, well, let's talk about that, because perhaps we have a misunderstanding about what they are, or we have a different experience, and there's genuinely a difference in the organization. So, and interestingly, about a third of you think architecture is the hardest. Personally, I think that's the easiest, but it's kind of what I do for a living, so I guess you'd expect me to think that was the easiest. But it often seems to people like it will be the hardest until we've spent some time doing it, and then it turns out to be not so hard after all. Okay, so that was just a little exercise to get us thinking about which enablers are hard and easy, and you could have that conversation with people in your own organisation as well. It's a good way to get people talking and thinking about process. Okay, so that's the enablers. Let's talk a little about BPM maturity. Don't forget that if you've got, see, we've got one question that's come in there. Let me deal with that right now. Nick Lloyd asked, does process governance mostly live in the PI circle? So if you imagine the PO and PI circles, it's hard, I think, to just say any of the enablers lives in just one circle. If governance is about, I think it's largely about the respond node in the PO circle. But it's also about setting the targets, it's about doing the assessment, then the response. But then, of course, a process owner with others is going to trigger the PI circle, and the change that should come from a process improvement project should now show up in the analysis we do, the tracking we do in the POs via the PO circle. So I can't say, you know, that any of the enablers lives in just one circle. And I think the whole point of the circles is that we're so much better off when we've got both of them. Almost every organization has some form of PI circle. You know, everyone's trying to make stuff work better. And most of your organizations probably have some defined process improvement methodology. Lean, Six Sigma, Sprint Pip, whatever it is, you'll have that methodology and you'll be good at using it. What PO circle adds, of course, is a formal, evidence-based way of making a decision about which processes, of the hundreds or thousands of processes that we've got, which ones should we work on next? Where is the return on process, if you like? Okay, so back here to BPM maturity. Keep those questions coming in if you have some more. Here for BPM maturity. Now you'll know about maturity models, the 5-level maturity model, originally produced, of course, to assess the ability of the capability of people, of organizations to build large software systems, but we use it for all sorts of things these days, and we can apply it to BPM. So we're applying it here to the maturity by which we manage our processes. I'm not talking about a particular process, but we're talking about our management of all of our processes. So 5 levels. At level 1, that's very low maturity. Level 5, very high maturity. Level 1, we can't spell BPM. Level 5, it's so much built into our culture and the way we work, it's kind of disappeared. So quite a range there. Now you can see, of course, we've got the columns that are now the enablers. And this is very useful because having a single number of maturity, BPM maturity for an organization isn't that useful. You know, it's a very average, abstract kind of thing to say our organization has BPM maturity of 2.4. So what? But if we can start doing that for each of the enablers, so we can do, we do this from some surveys and other mechanisms, but simple enough ways of doing it to establish an assessment for each of the enablers. Then we could say here for architecture, for example, currently showing they're just at 1.5. We want to be at 3.1 in say 12 months time. So we've got this gap. Now, what is it we've got to do over the next 12 months when we do the next assessment? If we're doing annual assessments, if we do the next assessment, that we've got some chance of meeting our goal. So obviously we can do that kind of thing. We can set targets for each of our enablers, and now we've got a target gap. So we've now given ourselves some very specific targets, and we'll see in a minute how we can get even more particular about that. And the whole point of BPM maturity, of course, is that given that we think managing our processes and improving our processes is a good thing, that process-based management is good, then now we're saying, okay, we should get better at it. How can we measure our maturity, our ability to do this? How can we track it? So that's what this is for. Here's another little poll. Yeah, obviously, we can't do a full assessment here. What we're trying to do here, this is just for the process measurement enabler, and it's showing the 5 levels there. I'll let you read them, but level 5 is really good. Level 1, we seldom do it. Where do you think you are in your organization right now? By the way, I'm not tracking who's saying this, so we're not recording your name against any of your votes, so you can say what you like. So what do we think? So, okay, so we've got some very honest people at level 1. That's a very common number I find in organizations, I have to say. 3, yeah. So we do it for a few. This is just a few data points, of course, so we can't extrapolate to the world. But this is pretty right, I think, in my experience at organizations. We measure some things during a project, or we decide the process isn't working, so we start a process improvement project and we measure like crazy for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and then we stop doing it. Level 5, I'm glad to see we've got at least, what's that? That's probably one organization there, because that's where we need to be. You know the story. If we're not measuring, we're not managing, and we wouldn't have a clue whether we're improving. So measurement is going to be important. So that's the kind of thing. I mean, that's a very simplistic view of how this thing works, of course, in terms of a maturity assessment. But that's the sort of thing we're doing. And then what does that allow us to do? Well, it allows us to do this. Wouldn't it be terrific if each of our organizations had this roadmap of building BPM maturity? Now, this is a more or less real one from a client of mine. None of you will recognize it, I think. Well, maybe one person would if you're there. But I've taken out the names and changed a bit of it, so it's not meant to be a particular organization. But you can see here that for each of the enablers, so for mindset, we've got current assessment of 1.5, and our target for 12 months is for the next assessment is 2.0. So what have we got to do through that? Well, we've defined some initiatives there, and they can be backed up with project plans and resources, and now we can start tracking. Now we've got lots of stakes in the ground of how we're going to get better and better at process-based management. And of course, we do the same for each of the enablers, however it fits. And this is, of course, just a summary picture. But this is a great, when we do this, a big poster on the wall. Good for communications, good to build mindset, good to identify capability, good to get people involved and asking. So there's maturity assessment. We have a question about setting targets. Let me come back to that in a moment. Maturity, let's now just talk quickly about how we pull all of this together. Okay, so in the center of the screen, you can see we've got the circles turning. That's our objective. And you know something of what I mean by that now. Across the top, to remind us, we've got primacy of process, we've got a process architecture, and we've got all of the things involved in increasing our BPM maturity, our increasing ability to do good, solid process-based management, all of that being enabled by the 7 enablers. So what's that mean in practice? Well, I wrote a book about all of this, so we can't cover all of that right now, but I'll briefly talk on some of this now, and then in the following 2 webinars, we'll get into some more detail. So how do we get going? How do we start? So now I'm just assuming for simplicity's sake here that we don't have a process architecture. We're starting with a blank sheet. Perhaps none of you are in that position, but so that we can talk about it more easily, let's just assume we're starting from that position. So, but at the very least, I would, even if you said we've got something, I would review it in this way. So let's start. We start always with organizational strategy. And that's literally with the strategy documents, vision, mission, purpose, whatever your strategic document looks like, whatever it's called, then that's what we start with. And what we want to do is essentially identify what it is we promise and to whom in that strategy. That's what a strategy does, doesn't it? We often call them value propositions, but what is it we promise to deliver and to whom? And it's those promises that will get delivered by our core, our highest level to start with, core processes. Now that's a reasonably straightforward thing to do. If you don't have a nicely written strategy, then presumably someone in the organization, perhaps all of you, have some understanding of why you come to work. You know what the organization does, so we can work on it like that. So some people will have I've worked with strategies that had no documentation, some that have got, a nice little cute poster that hangs on the wall, and one other I did had a 10-page strategy, which promised to do everything for everyone all around the world. It was an interesting strategy when you turned it into a set of processes. So anyway, start with strategy. That's important. And then we've got the highest level processes, 2 or 3 or 4 of them. An example of a high-level process for a hospital would be something like care for patients, for example. Pretty obvious. And then we'll maybe bring that down, decompose those processes just down 2 levels. So now we've got 3 levels of core processes, and we'll do the same thing for management and support processes. So now we've got, I don't know, depends on the number of high-level processes you have, but you've got at least 200 processes, probably, somewhere in the range of 200 to 300 processes, management, core, and supporting processes. So that's a very good start. I don't mean that we'll always stop at level 2, the 3rd level, but that'll do to start with. That's more than enough to get on with. And then we've got to, discuss that throughout the organisation, socialise it, argue about it, debate it, change it, and we're all the time improving it. Put it up on screens, do some big posters, hang it on the wall, just let people talk about it. And what are we doing there? We're raising capability, we're building mindset, we're improving the architecture, so we're working on the enablers as we do that. Now, we've got hundreds of processes, so I think the big mistake is to say, let's start improving them all. No, just take a few, and I think 5 is a good number. Now, maybe you'd prefer 3 or 4. Or, I wouldn't take many more than 5, though. You could do it for 1 if you want to, but you can do more than 1, I think. We can do better than that. So I just usually say 5. Now we just pick them. All sorts of ways to pick them. We'll get into that in later webinars. But let's say we've got 1 management, 2 core, and 1 support processes to give some measure across, and the interesting processes that have some potential to be improved. And we'll work on that, and we'll get the active process management going. We'll get the circles turning. We'll have a process owner. We'll do KPIs, targets, all those sorts of things. And when those 5 processes are under stable process management, then we can pick another 5, get those going. When that's okay, then we can pick, maybe we're picking 10 then. So then we can start building up this kind of incremental approach. And I promise you that that's going to work much better than saying, okay, from the start, let's pick 50 and try and do them all at once. I'm not saying that's impossible, but gee, it's really, really, really difficult. And your chances of being successful are, I think, quite low. So we just keep repeating that as we go. So in other words, we're getting the circles turning. And we're just doing it in that kind of incremental way. And I think we'll find that the incremental way will end up getting us to where we want to be much faster than trying to do it as a sort of big bang approach. Now, there was a question about how we set the target that might be asking about maturity targets, or it might be about performance targets. Let's assume it's about maturity targets, because that's kind of when it came in. Well, it's a matter of discussion. You're not going to go from level 1 to level 4 in 12 months. Right? I mean, these are difficult. Level 1 to level 2 is pretty easy. 2 to 3 is a very big step. 3 to 4 is a big step. Get to 4, stay there long enough, you'll get to 5. So you can say, okay, we're at 1.5 now. What would we have to do to be at 2.5? And then you just say, is that even reasonable? Can we do that? So there's a bit of a sensibility testing for that. We do it in workshops, lots of conversation going on, and you have drafts of the roadmap. And if you stand back and look at the roadmap and say, yeah, gee, that'd be nice, but we're not going to do that. We don't have the resources. Well, okay, step it back a bit. If we were talking about, because I've mentioned a couple of times setting targets in the PO circle, setting performance targets for our processes. Well, that's obviously very process dependent, depends on the environment in which it works, what it's supposed to achieve. It's also very dependent on its current level of performance as well. And one of the big mistakes that we all make and are forced to make sometimes by management is someone dreams up a target. It currently takes 10 hours to execute a process, and someone just by magic says it should happen in 2 hours. And we've got no idea whether that's even possible. We may not even have a good idea about, within which limits it's currently performing. So, we do our best, I guess, but ideally, many of you will understand this. Ideally, we'd be tracking current performance. We'd see how it's working, within which limits it's working, and then understand what a target might mean, and then we can run process improvement projects to see what we can do. Okay, what else have we got? Oh, I see. Nick Lloyd is now David Burton. I don't understand that, David or Nick, but presumably someone's in. Can we have some samples on point 2? I'll have to take that on notice. I'm not sure what point 2 is now. Oh, you meant, if you meant enable, no, you didn't. Okay, don't know. We'll take that on notice. I don't have any other questions here yet. Was there any chat that we needed to deal with, Amit? I'll let you do that, because let me just wrap up my piece and I'll hand back to Amit, and he can tell us about what's going to happen next and wrap up the session. So what we're going to be doing in the next 2 webinars, the content we're going to be dealing with, I want to get stuck into developing a process architecture next time. Follow this trail from strategy to promises to high-level processes to architecture. How do we actually make that? We'll spend the whole webinar talking about that. I'll run through with some examples, and then we'll have some conversation about that. And then in the week after that, it's really about how we're going to use that. What does active process management look like? And it's really about how we use the architecture, measurement, and governance enablers to get us to the change enabler, to making those improvements all the time, providing support and developing the mindset that lets us do that, and the capability, of course. So that's the sort of things we're going to be doing in the next couple. Keep the questions coming in even after the webinar. Keep asking questions. If you're in India and you'd like to have conversations with us, with smaller groups, one-to-one even, talk to Mr. Amit about that. I'm sure he'd be happy to organise that. If you're elsewhere in the world and you'd like to do that, then find me somehow on LinkedIn or wherever. I'm not hard to find, and we can set something up. But if you'll have lots of questions, I'm sure, and lots of things and lots of challenges. Maybe there's a bunch of stuff you don't agree with, you'd like to discuss. Happy to do all of that. I'll hand back to Amit now. Thank you all for listening. I'll hand back to Amit, and he can give you the details of more webinars and wrap it up. And we've got a minute or 2 if there's any other questions or chat. Thanks, Amit.
Thank you so much, Roger. Such a insightful session that we had. We discussed about 5 major topics in this session, starting with the principle of business process management, as you shared, as a primacy of the process. Though the organization is defined vertically, but the values are always delivered cross-functionally. So the primacy of process is the first thing every organization should first start thinking about it. Followed by, thank you so much, Tregear, about the Tregear circle, Roger. It gives a lot of information as well as some of the questions that we have encountered few times. And if I may ask you to please give your thoughts also onto this. There are many consultants who are more involved, or the organizations who are more involved in process re-engineering. Some tool like Lean Six Sigma. So when they look at this PO and PI circle, how do you suggest, or where do you think this re-engineering, this particular methodology fits within the BPM?
Okay, so, and that ties in, I think, with a question we've got here about what's the difference between process management and process governance.
Yeah.
So I think, so let me talk firstly about a spectrum of change. We talk about improvement, and we often mean small changes. And we talk about re-engineering or innovation, and we mean big changes. Now, I think all of that involves changing processes, and it's the ends of a spectrum. So at one time we're doing small changes, and one other time we're doing big changes. And there are different tools and techniques involved at either end of the spectrum, of course. But it's still about identifying the need for process improvement. That is, identifying the need to improve the way we create, accumulate, and deliver value. Big change or small change, it's still about that. It's still about process-based management. And that's why I think process-based management is the big picture. It's what we do. It's the way we should think about the organization. To borrow someone else's phrase, process-based management is a mindset that comes along with a set of tools. So I think process-based management is why we're there.
Yeah.
Whether we're going to call something innovation or improvement or re-engineering, we got all of these different terms, and different people mean different things by them. So we really should be defining them in our organization. So management, I think process management is the big picture. It's everything we do. Governance, to answer that particular question, I think is one of the ways in which we manage. We model, so we describe our processes, we measure, we govern, we change, etc. So I think the 7 enablers are what enables us to have the circles turning, which is to say, to do good process-based management.
Thank you.
So I answered 2 questions then, I think.
Yeah, one more question here. Roger, we discussed about the 7 enablers, basis on which an organization can evaluate their business processes on the maturity model. Organization can select the process and relevant maturity. It is not something that an organization should keep a target of maturity level 5 for each and every process. For some processes, perhaps level 3 is sufficient enough for an organization to achieve, whereas in some of the processes, they may require to go beyond level 3 to level 4 and level 5. Thank you so much also for sharing about the roadmap for BPM. This is, I'm sure, an organization can use this as a reference, and then they can plan their own roadmap for the organization. So in this episode 2, our major objective, thank you, Roger, with you, we are able to achieve what are the essential elements an organization should think when they start planning about the business process management. What are the things they should keep in mind, how they should evaluate their as-is, how they should plan their to-be. In the next session, in the next episode, with Roger, we will be back again. It will be a question and answer format also. It's a combination of a question and answer along with a presentation, where we will have more detailed discussion about business process architecture. I saw a few of the processes about how do you find out the processes and decompose the processes. So those questions will get more detailed information in our episode 3 that is going to be broadcasted live next week, same time, same place. Please keep on sharing your question. After this seminar, you will get an email with the recording link, and you can share all your questions with us, and we will be very happy to provide you the information on that. Once again, thank you very much. Roger, thank you once again to you for your time. See you again next week, next Friday, 11 o'clock IST.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you all then. Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.